Hello and welcome to a special edition of Daily Biz brought to you by VTV International. I'm Hainam from Hanoi, and in this edition, we will discuss in depth the World Bank's latest taking stock report released last week to learn more about Vietnam's economic recovery in 2015 and next year's prospects.
The World Bank's latest predictions for Vietnam's economy indicate sustainable growth and low inflation for the country. Those statistics heightened from forecasts in mid-2015 prove that Vietnam's economy has responded well to external economic changes. Administrative reforms and policies supporting businesses are considered key factors driving development forward.
The government is right to focus on the industrial economy. Investment from the government and FDI sectors supports businesses. Taxations and customs procedures have also been streamlined.
It is estimated that Vietnam's GDP could increase by 8% in the next 20 years. However, integration is likely to lower the state budget due to reduced import-export taxation. State-owned companies and commercial banks are feeling the pressure of unresolved loans and debts.
Preferential treatment for companies are abundant but not so effective. Authorities must research to select the best treatments for companies. Improving taxation management is one way to tackle this issue.
The global financial environment will be a challenging one in the future. As a result, companies may face difficulties with loans requests. According to the World Bank report, flexible macro policies can be employed to ensure the stability and development of the Vietnamese economy.
Joining us is senior economist Sébastien Nicart, a member of the Taking Stock team. Mr. Sébastien Nicart, welcome to our interview and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, compared with the previous years, 2015 seems to witness a positive trend in Vietnam's economy. So as a member of the Taking Stock team, what do you think are the most remarkable changes in Vietnam's economy in the last years?
What we are seeing this year is basically a strengthening of the recovery. The recovery of Vietnam's economy started in the last quarter last year and has been firming up over the course of this year. We now expect GDP growth to come in around 6.5%, probably even a bit higher than that. The main drivers of the recovery are two. One is the strong performance of the export-oriented manufacturing sector, and the second one is basically a recovery and a strengthening of domestic demand, and we see both very strong numbers in terms of domestic consumption and investment.
One of Vietnam's important tasks in 2015 is to improve the business environment and to reform the state-owned enterprises or SOEs. So far, what do you think about the progress of these tasks?
In terms of the business climate, we actually had some good news earlier this year when the World Bank's Doing Business report was released and showed that Vietnam has actually improved its performance from 93 to now 90s. I think that's a witness of basically improved conditions across a range of areas, including starting business. We've seen improvements in terms of cross-border trade. We've also seen some improvements in terms of access to electricity. But there's still an important reform agenda that remains in this regard. Most importantly, we see that Vietnam's performance is where there's room for improvement is in the areas of bankruptcy legislation, paying taxes despite Resolution 19. Now, the second area that you mentioned, SOE reform, here we see that there has been quite some activity in terms of equitizing SOEs with the objective to achieve the target that the government has set itself. However, we also note that many of these transactions actually only involve minority shares. And in our view, it's actually important to also have quality equitizations in the sense that majority stakes go to private sector investors, because that really generates the benefits in terms of bringing in capital, but also bringing in business practices, new technology, and know-how into these companies, and then really giving them a boost in terms of performance.
On November 10th, the Vietnamese National Assembly approved a resolution on the socio-economic targets for 2016, which include the GDP growth rate of 6.7%, the CPI rise under 5%, export turnover rising by 10%, and the ratio of imports to exports no more than 5%, among others. So can you give an assessment of the possibility of achieving those targets and compare them with the World Bank's predictions?
So our forecast for 2016 is just a notch lower than the forecast that was approved by the National Assembly. We expect 6.6. The National Assembly expects 6.7% GDP growth. In terms of CPI inflation, we also expect CPI inflation to remain below 5%. We expect 3% next year. So broadly, our forecasts, our expectations are in line with those that were discussed in the National Assembly. What is important so is that this is a baseline assessment, and obviously there are a lot of risks, mostly actually in terms of the global environment. You know that this year was a very volatile year. We saw a lot of external events. In August, global stock markets crashed and so on. And Vietnam's economy has proven quite resilient to those external developments over the year. And we believe it's quite important going forward that the macroeconomic policy framework remains flexible to adjust to changing circumstances globally.
In your opinion, what are the hindrances to achieving those targets? And what will Vietnam have to do to overcome those hindrances?
And in our view, I would like to highlight two particular ones. One is continued structural reforms, where we see that if you look at the longer term trends that sort of have been shaping economic performance in Vietnam, we actually see that particularly the domestic private sector is facing productivity challenges. We see very strong performance in the FDI sector. We actually see reasonable performance in the SOE sector, but the domestic private sector has really not delivered the kind of growth performance that we would like to see, and the domestic private sector should be really the driver of the economy going forward. And I think there are a number of reforms that are needed in terms of improving the business climate, leveling the playing field, ensuring that private sector enterprises do have access to land, capital, skilled labor, and so on, and then also to provide incentives to those companies to really perform at their best. I also think that in terms of the macroeconomic environment, we actually note that there's been a remarkable improvement in terms of creating macroeconomic stability. Inflation is at record lows, and we believe that this is a good time to consolidate macroeconomic stability and to rebuild some of the buffers. And here I would like to highlight in particular on the fiscal accounts, we see that fiscal imbalances remain quite high in Vietnam. Obviously, public debt has been rising over the past few years, and I think with the economy strengthening, this is really the time to start reducing the fiscal deficit, gradually stabilizing public debt, and then hopefully over time even reduce public debt.
The World Bank's latest Taking Stock report pays a special emphasis on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or TPP. Based on analysis of the scope and the impact of the TPP, Taking Stock spells apart for policy implications. As part of the TPP, Vietnam committed to the United States Vietnam Plan for the Enhancement of Trade and Labor Relations, which requires the country's laws and regulations to permit workers without distinction employed by an enterprise to form a grassroots labor union of their own choosing without prior authorization. The agreement commits Vietnam to put this provision into effect before the date of the TPP's entry into force. To make the most of the opportunities in the TPP, Vietnam should further enhance its competitiveness, including investment in roads, power, port, and logistics services, and further efforts to enhance the efficiency of border clearance procedures.
talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP, I can see that this year the Taking Stock dedicates a whole section to the TPP's impact on Vietnam. So what is the World Bank's viewpoint on the Vietnam's prospects once the TPP is ratified?
So I think in terms of the TPP, the World Bank, like many other observers of the TPP, expects Vietnam to benefit quite considerably from TPP once it's ratified and comes into force. And there are two, I think, primary challenges. One is the direct effect in terms of opening or improving trade access, market access in key markets. And for key products such as textile exports, where tariffs are really going to be reduced quite significantly under TPP. That will boost Vietnam's growth performance, and it will enable Vietnam as the sort of economy with the lowest per capita GDP to benefit in particular in terms of attracting labor-intensive manufacturing to the country. The other channel through which TPP is expected to support the Vietnamese economy is through anchoring structural reforms. As you know, the TPP is not just about reducing tariffs, it's a much more comprehensive and deeper agreement. It touches areas such as public procurement, SOE reform, it touches labor market issues, it touches upon intellectual property rights, investor protection. There's many areas that are included in the provisions of the TPP.
Once again, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
And that's all for this special edition of Daily Biz. Do log on to vtv4.vn and youtube.com/vtv4go to keep up to date with our programs. And don't forget to catch up with the latest economic news in Vietnam with our next Daily Biz bulletin at 10 p.m. Hanoi time. Until then, have a nice day.